All right, muscleheads, welcome to the inaugural episode of the Super Musclecast. After 300 years of research and training, the Super Muscle Busters are ready to take you on an auditory odyssey through the marvelous and muscular world of Kinnikuman. I'm T.G. Moxley, a longtime Kinniku fan, and I'm joined by a newcomer to the series, my co-host, the Punch King. Punch, how are you doing, and how did you first hear about Kinnikuman?
Oh, it's going great. I think, like most people, at least here in America, my first exposure with Kinnikuman was through the muscle figurines that you'd get in the 80s. I didn't even know that was called anything other than muscle men, and these little, usually peach-colored, sometimes other-colored figurines that would come in a little plastic trash can. And I only really learned of the anime sort of in my teenage years in the later 90s, so this is kind of a new experience to me.
And I think that is a very common experience that you've just described. I remember being a child in the late 80s, standing in the aisle at Toys R Us amidst the Tonka trucks and X-Men's and G.I.'s Joe and looking upon those trash cans. I really have to say that I regret not buying any when I was young. The Hasbro Series 2 Ultimate Warrior and the Muscle Trash Can are two items that I had the opportunity to purchase as a small child, didn't, and then spent several years regretting afterwards. And it's really only the muscle loss that has followed me into adulthood. But yeah, in addition to being little tiny rubber figures, this was a cartoon and prior to that, a manga in Japan. So these two fellows, who collectively are known as Yude Tamago, or Boiled Egg, started publishing all the way back in May of 1979 and kept it up until 87. And then the anime started airing on NTV in April of 1983, meaning that we are recording this in the 40th anniversary month of Kinnikuman, the anime, which I'm particularly pleased about. Over the course of this podcast, we're going to be doing an episode-by-episode recap and summary of the Kinnikuman series, paying special attention to the ways in which it intersects with the world of professional wrestling, which is how Punch King and I initially met and became friends, and is really where the majority of our knowledge comes from. And I don't just mean the majority of our knowledge for the sake of this podcast. I'd say that the most of my cortex is pretty much just wrestling trivia.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. But it's interesting you bring up that the cartoon was started airing on NTV in 1983. I was thinking this must have had some penetration in Western English-speaking audiences for there to be the little figures released. Do you know if maybe that there was a translation or some airing of this in American or English-speaking television that maybe I just wasn't exposed to as a kid that went along with the release of the Little Muscle Men?
No, I think it was strictly a matter of the kinkeshi is what they're called in Japan. Keshi being a rubber eraser, and then also an entire world of little rubber figurines and collectibles from anime series and so forth. Bandai started making the Kinnikuman Keshi or Kinkeshi in 1983, I guess to go along with the release of the anime series, and it launched enough of a merchandising empire. You, at one point, kind of speculated to me that, knowing nothing else about Kinnikuman, it seemed as if it was the Japanese equivalent of He-Man. And I have to say, just in terms of, merchandising power over the decades, it seems to be very much a good comparison that you made there. But no, it was Bandai that made the Kinkeshi, and in 85, the license was picked up by Mattel to release the figures in the United States, I guess. Just looking at how incredibly popular they were in Japan and figuring wrestling was a universal or even intergalactic enough subject matter that it would translate. And they were successful without the backing of a TV show, which in the 1980s is a pretty impressive feat for a toy, and I think a testament to how wonderful and universal some of the character design in Kinnikuman is, although some of the other character design is horrific and racist, and is probably the reason why there will never be an English language release of Kinnikuman. So, in summary, Kinnikuman is a land of contrasts. Would you like to add anything, Punch?
Just that I think that it's remarkable that they achieved that level of penetration even here in America. And if anything, my comparison to He-Man may have been a little bit on the conservative side. They've had many successful spin-offs and video games that I'm aware of, and I am not even really tapped into the Kinnikuman fandom. So this has been kind of a big deal culturally, and it's reached a lot of people, even without a lot of the target media being available in the English language over here in America for a long time.
I will say this, though. Just picture this in your head. A He-Man beat-em-up in the style of the X-Men arcade beat-em-up. Or a He-Man fighting game in the style of Street Fighter. So, clearly, Mattel just doesn't have their eyes on the ball with their IPs, if you ask me.
I'd be all over it, but, He-Man's a little off the subject, but I feel like the attempts to launch it in rebooted forms or in any form that really departs from the 80s cartoon have met with mixed success at best, and that isn't my understanding of what the case is with Kinnikuman. They've been successful.
Mm-hmm. And also, I would be deceiving the listeners if I failed to mention that Kinnikuman did have a certain degree of penetration in Europe, which I don't know too much about. I believe that it ran in France for a while. I know that the Tiger Mask anime was surprisingly popular in Italy, and wonder if Kinnikuman might have also been there as well, but I have to look into that and plan on discussing it in a future episode. So there is that as well. All right, so without any further ado, let's hop right into the show. So, Episode 1 of Kinnikuman is divided into two small stories, as are many of the early episodes. You don't get episodes that have a continuous arc until a little bit later, because we are beginning Kinnikuman in the Kaiju Extermination arc, which is a parody of Ultraman and other Japanese hero comics, and is a little bit more episodic and, well, a lot more episodic and contained than what we're going to see later in the series when things start to really come together and the pot really starts boiling with long fights and dramatic tournament arcs and so forth. But for now, let's enjoy some light entertainment at the Gyudon Lovers Club, the All Japan Gyudon Lovers Club, where Kinnikuman, who is president, his vice president, and two ordinary members are enjoying. Somehow between the four of them, they order 3 extra-large servings of gyudon and each end up with a bowl, so already completely unwatchable. And indeed, and then things break down into a tag team match, and we get to see the earliest influence of one Antonio Inoki, the maestro of New Japan Pro Wrestling, on the series Kinnikuman, as the first wrestling move broken out on the show is one octopus hold, which, as a fan of Tecmo World Wrestling, where I learned many of my wrestling techniques and is responsible for me calling the Enziguri the back brain kick erroneously to this day, I really appreciate a good octopus hold. Quite frankly, if you grew up on Tecmo World Wrestling, the moveset you'll see in Kinnikuman will be right up your alley. It's a giant swinging event.
Yeah, I was a fan of Tecmo World Wrestling as well, and yeah, I will co-sign everything you just said there.
And then, in addition to Kinnikuman, I'll admit the All Japan Gyudon Lovers Club, they don't play a large role in the series going forward. One guy who does play a recurring role in the series going forward is Yosaku, who at this point is the Gyudon chef at the restaurant, but we'll soon see that he lives up to his nickname, Be Anywhere, Do Anything, Yosaku-san. He's one of the characters that the anime takes from the manga and elevates from small one-shot or multi-part bit characters and turns into a more frequent comic relief recurring character. We're going to see a lot of them as time goes on. A lot of people who make brief forays into Kinnikuman's life in the manga are actually recurring cast members, mostly in a comic relief form because they don't directly contribute to the important fights in the anime. And Yosaku is one of them, and he's having himself a good time. As you mentioned while we were watching the episode, while the 4 members of the Gyudon Lovers Club wrestle, he takes a hoe and starts furiously hoeing the floor of his restaurant, which, you know, it's his restaurant. He can hoe what he likes. And then a UFO lands. But before we get to that, do you have any thoughts on the meeting of the All Japan Gyudon Lovers Club?
Well, like you say, it seems like it's not really... On one hand, they're not really figured in as a major part of where the series is going, but it is a nice character establishing moment, and it sets the tone well, I think. You know, it's gets us off on a very goofy and very 1980s Japan start. And that was my impression, you know, watching it here 40 years later as an American, that this is a time capsule and it's a kind of fun, you know, cultural look, not only at like sort of a wacky side of like weird 1980s Japanese cartoons, but as we'll see later on when Terryman comes in, some of it reflects back on, you know, a wacky Japanese side of the American side of 1980s cartoons. Mm-hmm. This all sets us off on a nice tone, I think, in this opening segment. Now, you mentioned the UFOs. I see those appear, and the first thing I think is a War of the Worlds reference, possibly, with the appearance of it to Three Legs.
Yeah, and then the other thing going on here is Close Encounters of the Third Kind, as the UFO starts to play a horrible discordant memory or melody, and Kinnikuman, I'm having horrible discordant memories of it right now, and Kinnikuman busts out a piano and starts trying to play along and ends up doing a horrific rendition of the Japanese nursery children's song, The Hare and the Tortoise, which I'll toss on at the end of this episode so that people can hear it and appreciate what it sounds like when Kinnikuman isn't butchering it. But yeah, they got the Close Encounters of the Third Kind sequence with the music, and luckily Gobugari, the detective of the West Sumidegawa police force, shows up. You mentioned this show being a time capsule of Japanese culture, and I will mention that this fellow right here is a parody of the police character Raisuke Kuroiwa from the show Daitokai, which was a Japanese cop show in the late 1970s, very popular, that aired on NTV. And Gobugari is another character who had 2 appearances in the comic, but will be a recurring feature in the anime. And thank God for it. I love the way that he shows up, shoots his gun in the air, and fails to solve anyone's problems, then leaves in a huff. It's a good bit.
I was wondering about that. I'm glad that you told me that. I'd wondered if that had been, you know, my thought at the time was a parody of like American cop shows, with they come in just bristling with guns and don't actually accomplish anything. So that is good information to know. And I'll say that the subtitles on the version I've been watching are also really good about holding my hand and helping me to get some of the Japanese cultural references, like the tortoise and the hare, or helping me to get some of the puns. So it's actually like I'm learning something and enriching myself from watching Kinnikuman.
Shout out to the Hokuto no Gun crew for the subtitles on the first 86 episodes of Kinnikuman.
Indeed.
Yeah, and so meet Alexandria, a little guy with glasses, although I forget that he has glasses, and every time he reaches up and adjusts his glasses, it terrifies me because it looks like he's pinching his own eyeball. But he's a little guy with a crest on his head and silly wrestling trunks, so you can tell that he's the same species as Kinnikuman, comes out and fingers Kinnikuman as the prince of the Kinniku clan and implores him to return to his home planet where he can be properly trained as a fighter because his record on Earth is deplorable. He tells the story of Kinnikuman's arrival on Earth, which was that his parents were on a 2-day, 1-night holiday through space, and they happened to notice a pig in the crib with their little baby, and one thing led to another, and they tossed the baby out the airlock, and he landed on Earth. The Kinniku clan graph that Meat shows up to demonstrate to Kinnikuman that he's not just a hero, but a preeminent superhero, shows the Kinniku clan at the very head of a line of superheroes that then diverges into Ultraman and Kamen Rider and the off-branch of American superheroes like Batman and Spider-Man and all of those other mans.
We'll find out what becomes of Spider-Man soon.
Oh, we will. And it tickles me that not only is Kinnikuman very clearly an Ultraman parody with his little crest on his head and his Kinniku Flash and Kinniku Beam attacks, which I haven't watched Ultraman, and I'll admit that I'm really tempted to watch the American dub of it from way back before I was born because I'm just so gruesomely fascinated by what it must look like, but that won't actually help me have any insight for the sake of this podcast, so maybe I need to watch OG Ultraman and leave silly American Ultraman to someone else. But anyway, Kinnikuman, it's really audacious that Kinnikuman is not only an Ultraman parody, but he's explicitly positioned in the first episode of the anime as a member of a clan of superheroes that predates and is preeminent over the Ultra people.
I had missed that. I think that part wasn't translated in the subtitles, but...
You are correct about that, and I will say that my insights into any kind of Japanese matters are very frequently aided by the translations provided by AK of Troy on the Kinnikuman manga, which occasionally are slightly more detailed than the Hokuto no Gun subtitles on the anime. So I'm kind of coming in here. I've got a loaded boot, brother. I got a gimmick that I've got over you. So,
well, that's perfectly fine with me. Please proceed.
Yep. Yeah. And so, speaking of differences between the manga and anime, Yosaku plays a greater role in proving to Kinnikuman that he is indeed the prince of the planet Kinniku than he does in the manga. In the manga, basically, Meat tells Kinnikuman, hey, you have the Kinniku mark on your body. Kinnikuman pulls down his pants and it's on his butt. Whereas in this one, Yosaku goes rummaging around in Kinnikuman's trunks looking for the mark. He's using his long pipe to get in there and poke around, and the embers fall out of the pipe and burn Kinnikuman, and he jumps out of his trunks and tucks his head between his butt and looks like he's gonna just jump off the top and land on his face with his butt, and that's when you see that the kin mark is on his butt cheek, his left butt cheek, to be precise. But anyway, Kinnikuman will not return to Planet Kinniku and be trained and regain his birthright. He instead insists that he has important work on Earth, which is holding a sign shilling for something called, in the anime, it's Hara's Cabaret. In the manga, it's Horsey's Cabaret. I don't know why that is. But the important thing is that in the scene where Kinnikuman is holding up his sign for Hara's Cabaret, there's a sign that says Dory, and then above it in katakana, there's a sign that says Terry. Ooh, the Funk Brothers.
We're already getting our first wrestler references. Well, not first, but first by name.
Yeah, first by name. And then, and in fact, in the manga, this doesn't appear in the anime, but in the manga, there is an additional sign that says Dusty Roads. So, we're already packing it in tight. So Kinnikuman won't return back to Planet Kinniku, so Meat summons a steel cage, which Kinnikuman calls a deathmatch ring. I've never quite understood what deathmatch means in the context of Japanese wrestling. To me, it seems to be anytime you've got a gimmick match, you might as well call it a deathmatch, and Kinnikuman tends to bear that out pretty closely.
I've never understood completely what it means in the context of American wrestling, to be honest. How is a death match different? It's a no disqualification match, I guess, and there will probably be props involved. So this meets that standard.
Absolutely. And quite frankly, they get some good use out of the cage. You know, Kinnikuman goes for a drop kick on Gariki, his opponent, for this match to determine if he will return back to Planet Kinniku. Gariki ducks, and Kinnikuman pinballs off of all four walls of the cage. And then later on, he gets booted and, again, pinballs off of all four walls of the cage, and it's quite glorious. And I have to say, Kinnikuman's selling is on point in this match.
Well, he's got the facial expressions for sure. That'll prove pivotal.
Absolutely. And, you know, and not just the facial expressions, but the way that his body just accordions up when he charges at Gariki and gets the old palm to the head gimmick to stop him in his tracks. You know, I thought that was good. I feel like the slapstick physical violence is at an all-time best in this episode. I'm not sure, between this and the ending of the next episode, I'm not sure the series ever quite reaches these highs again. Nevertheless, there are good matches to come, but Kinnikuman tries his Kinniku Flash, Gariki dodges. He tries his Kinniku Beam, Gariki laughs at him and no-sells. It's a real Road Warrior kind of situation. And having used his only two moves, Kinnikuman is pretty much screwed until Gariki basically defeats himself by bear-hugging Kinnikuman until Kinnikuman's antic facial expressions cause him to go into spasms of laughter, and Gariki busts his own guts.
Yeah, that, indeed, he's hoisted by his own petard there.
Indeed, he laughed himself to death like a goddamn weasel from Roger Rabbit.
Although, it seemed a little odd to me that he no-sold the Kinniku Beam when Kinnikuman also wrote his name on his back.
You know, and that's something that doesn't happen in the manga.
Yeah, well, other than that, it was a pretty solid match.
I agree. 2.5 stars. Although maybe there is... No, you know what? I'm not going to make any kind of... The Tokyo Dome does not exist at this time, so we can leave poor Mr. Meltzer alone. Yeah, so Kinnikuman, having defeated Gariki through his exaggerated selling on the bear hug and causing his opponent's spine to break and guts to bust, is free from having to return home and face harsh training from his father. So, all in all, a happy end. Any final thoughts on episode 1A of Kinnikuman?
I will have a few things to note after when we get into episode 2. One point that occurred to me that I had seen, this is the introducing the characters episode. We're establishing what they look like, what they act like, who they are. And this was one thing I'd noticed, and I don't know if maybe they'll later visit it or not, but in terms of character design, you have Kinnikuman and his smaller cohort meet. They are mostly identical, as you said. You can tell that they are the same sort of guy. And it has a tradition in, other superhero works where you will have the superhero that runs around with the smaller version of themselves, the younger Superboy and that sort of thing. So it all stays with tradition. With the Kinnikuman character design, and I don't know if there's a better way or a better place to address this than now, the thing that struck me is that even among the other Kinniku folk, he is the only one with lips that look like that. And the only other place that I'm aware of that you see those lips are on some of the unfortunate racial caricature characters. And so it was something I've noted with interest, but I don't know, as I've said, I'm not really immersed in the Kinnikuman fandom, if this is anything of significance or if it's just an odd thing that I've noticed.
Yeah, so this is definitely something that's worth addressing, and it's one of those things where if you go too far in the direction of applying, say, American standards on what constitutes a racist caricature, you end up missing some of the nuances on local culture and things that might not actually be racist in context. But on the flip side, you can't ignore the fact that the United States of America has traditionally been a very large exporter of racist ideas and racist iconography to the world at large. And I think that, the sort of meta answer to that entire line of inquiry in Kinnikuman is that you get both. There are definitely examples of characters that I'd say are they have large lips or distinctive lips that are consistent with racial caricatures because they are explicitly racist racial caricatures of different groups. And then in the Kinnikuman instance, you have something that I've heard referred to in the anime community as Tarako lips, which are lips that resemble Codro, which if you Google Codro and look at it, and then you look at the lips and you think, oh, they look like that. And this has been a part of Japanese character design and caricature for I don't know how long, but quite some time, I would wager. Tarakachi, the Tamagotchi, so basically Codro, the Tamagotchi, has lips that look like two sacks of cod eggs on his face. And Jennifer, one of the mascot characters from Sunsoft's Hibareke series, he, despite the name Jennifer, he's a green anglerfish with big Codro lips. So it's a interesting kind of bit of character design you see in Japanese work. I think usually connoting a character that is somewhat silly or uncultured or foolish, or perhaps country bumpkin. And so that seems to be where Kinnikuman in particular is getting his lips. A lot of the facial features and other qualities he has, such as him smelling of garlic, are meant to be comical, grotesque characteristics that don't necessarily map onto any kind of broader caricature. But yeah, we're definitely going to encounter more stuff along those lines as time goes on, and answers are going to be less benign.
Indeed. We'll get a little bit of that next episode, won't we?
Yeah. There's a bunch of things about 1B, the man from America, that I wish were different. One thing that I'm glad is the same, though, is that it begins with the Japanese national diet debating the all-important question, Baba or Inoki, who is stronger? Baba is very strong, but Inoki has guts.
Shall we just get right to it, then?
Yeah, let's get right to it. Baba or Inoki, who is stronger?
All right. Well, the first thing that I noticed about this debate, you do see a plethora of American wrestlers assembled in the diet for debating this weighty issue. You don't see Dory Funk nor Terry Funk, although that's maybe to be expected given who's going to show up this episode.
Yeah, it's interesting the way that wrestlers generally, I mean, as time goes on, fewer and fewer wrestlers will make actual cameos in the series as more and more fictional characters exist and have taken characteristics from those wrestlers. But there definitely are some examples of wrestlers that exist at the same time as their fictional counterparts. So what disrupts this debate in the national diet is Kinkotsuman making his first appearance in the cartoon. This is a man who is, kind of like it's really an insult to Laparca to call this freaking skeleton guy a Laparca-esque wrestler figure. He's a guy in a bone costume with a skull for a face, and he's got his little red boots and his little gun and his long hair, and basically he's the chief of governors Tom Guycott from Clash at Demon Head. And he introduces Abdodula, who is a giant monster based on Abdullah the Butcher, who nevertheless, in the manga, Abdullah the Butcher makes a couple of cameo appearances, so he's able to exist at the same time as his giant space monster counterpart, yet Terry and Dory Funk don't exist at the same time as Terry Man, the superhero from America who shows up and saves the day from Abdodula and his menacing of the Japanese diet.
Well, Abdodula also had a couple of interesting design choices. His legs were furry, right? As if he was some sort of satyr or something.
And he had the tail. I think he is a satyr, which I don't get, but I don't like.
Yeah, it's odd. He has the gig marks on his forehead that match the real Abdullah the Butcher. He also has the regrettable lip design that matches offensive racial caricatures that we spoke on a little bit last time, and is similar to Kinnikuman's lips, the Codro lips.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of Kinnikuman merchandise that I wouldn't like to own, and I don't know how much merchandise Abdodula gets, but whatever it is, I'm sure it's in poor taste.
Maybe not much, because this fight concludes, right, with Terry Man shoots him and he's shown like broken into pieces falling on the ground with his gun, so he's dead now, right?
He's dead now, and this introduces the concept of permadeath to Kinnikuman. Although this is a comic and later cartoon aimed at kids, sometimes a man from America shows up and just shoots you dead and you don't come back. So yeah, in 2023, I really don't like the optics of what's going on there. I know he's just a space monster who happens to be named after and racially caricatured after a black man from Windsor, Ontario, but I still wish he hadn't got shot. Um, he has a kid though, Abdodullah Jr. He shows up in a later episode and I think survives. So the family lives on, although he's inherited his father's unfortunately furry legs and tail and, racist caricature face.
Yeah. You know,
Yeah.
one thing that struck me, and I guess for those of us who primarily would have seen him starting the earliest maybe in like 1989, but then through into his ECW time, Terry Funk, as I'm familiar with him in that context, looks a lot different than Terry Man, the Kinnikuman character who's based on him. And I'm wondering, and this is maybe an area where I need to do more research, how much of that is that the character design just diverges significantly from Terry Funk, or I don't think I've never seen Terry Funk with blonde hair, even in pictures of him from 1983. But Terry Man is almost kind of this, suave, debonair cowboy. He's got the blonde hair and, is, put off as being sort of this sort of caricature of American cowboy heroes in that he's dashing and,
He even looks cool when he's eating his favorite meal of hot dogs.
Green hot dogs.
Green hot dogs.
The point is, he doesn't look a lot like what I understood Terry Funk's image to be, which was more of sort of, maybe not to the extent of like Bruiser Brody, but he was kind of a roughhousing wild man. At least that's the Terry Funk that I'm familiar with. And that could be a lack of my own personal familiarity, because I haven't seen a lot of Terry Funk from the early 80s. I was 2 or 3 years old at the time.
Yeah, so I feel like this would be a good time to jump into a brief Terry Funk history lesson. Terry Funk's history in Japan dates to the early 1970s when he appeared with the JWA, wrestling some of Japan's top stars at the time. He and his brother Dory Funk Jr. won the NWA International Tag Team Championship from B.I. Cannon, the team of Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki. When Baba broke off and formed All Japan Pro Wrestling, coincidentally airing on NTV Channel 4, which later hosted Kinnikuman, Terry Funk followed him and was one of the top foreign stars on Baba's first tour. Funk continued to wrestle for Baba throughout the 70s and 80s, often appearing with his brother Dory Funk Jr., but wrestling with a variety of other tag team partners as well, including Johnny Weaver, Killer Carl Cox, the man who shares those initials, Dick Slater, Luke Graham, and the Patriot, not Del Wilkes. He was, of course, a rough, tough American cowboy-style heel until 1977, when he and his brother turned babyface against the team of Abdullah the Butcher and the Sheik. Coincidentally, the two real wrestlers that the kaiju in this episode are based on. And Terry eventually has his famous retirement with his "Forever, Forever, Forever," which lasted a couple of months on August 31st of 1983. The retirement lasted a couple of months, not the speech. So, and then Kinnikuman, the manga where the character design originates, is 1979, so the shorter hair and some of the tidier nature of the Terry Man appearance could be attributed to 70s Terry Funk versus the wild and crazy hair and facial hair of the Terry Funk that we know. He was a bit more of a handsome guy back then, although still not the Terry Man levels of handsome. I think to a certain degree, Terry Man is introduced as just being everything that Kinnikuman is not. You know, he gets the job done, he's respected, he's desired by the women, he doesn't smell of garlic, he gets the job of being Japan's only superhero and makes a lot of money, whereas Kinnikuman and Meat are left wrestling over a 10,000 yen note that he carelessly drops. And so he starts off as, even though he's on the side of good, he's Kinnikuman's enemy because he's everything that Kinnikuman would like to be. And that, more so than any particular resemblance to Terry Funk, is probably what's important.
Yeah, and he is mercenary in a way that Kinnikuman isn't, which is sort of what drives the plot of this episode, and what led to the 10,000 yen note being on the ground. So I see definitely they have the contrast set up there.
Absolutely, yes. And as you mentioned, the big contrast is not only does Terryman charge for his services, such as when he bills the Japanese national diet after shooting Abdodullah, but he also refuses to help in situations where payment cannot be remitted, such as when a young boy announces that his father has been taken by Sheik Seijin, a giant space monster that is obviously based on the wrestling Sheik, Abdullah the Butcher's tag team partner throughout much of the 70s in all Japan. And so the boy offers Terryman his piggy bank, and Terryman is disgusted with how little money the child can offer him and kicks the boy away, causing Kinnikuman to fire up and punch Terryman in the face and just send him flying. And it's the first bit of effective offense that Kinnikuman gets in the entire series, and he gets it because he's angry at this arrogant American refusing to help a child in need. And so Kinnikuman, now fired up on the spirit of justice, he feels it burning in his loins, activates his ability to become very, very large, the size of a giant space monster, and goes off to wrestle Sheik Seijin in a banger of a match. He eats some headbutts from the Sheik at first and also gets shot up by the Japanese Air Force, but comes back with a nice judo throw into a standing toe hold and a drop kick and a headlock. And Meat comments that when he wants to, the prince is actually a very good fighter. And Terryman, upon seeing this fired up Kinnikuman fighting for justice, fighting with the Yamato spirit, realizes the error of his ways, throws down his superhero badge that the Japanese government awarded him when they made him the only hero in Japan, and runs to join Kinnikuman in the fight, making this the first example of Kinnikuman making a friend out of an enemy through the demonstration of his burning fighting spirit, which I think is, as we'll see over time, the real heart and soul of the show.
Oh, yes. A couple of things I'd noticed about this sequence as well. Kinnikuman fires up and punches Terryman, and if I'm not mistaken, I think that is the only time that we've seen Terryman involved in close-in physical altercation. That's kind of another contrast in this episode, I noticed, that Kinnikuman fights and wrestles these monsters. Yes, he has his beam and his flash in the first episode, but he much more goes in for direct grappling and striking. Terryman's offense that we saw, if I'm not misremembering, was limited to shooting Abdodullah with his gun.
He's a shooter, brother.
I didn't think of it that way. And I'll just call out, unrelated to that, another high spot that I particularly enjoyed was seeing when the Air Force was warning Kinnikuman off of getting involved, which was a ridiculous idea anyway, but when the Air Force was doing that, I was just tickled by the imagery of you had one of the pilots with 1 foot out of the cockpit open, the plane is still flying, and he's standing outside of his plane, more or less, so that he can yell at Kinnikuman with a megaphone. I thought that I liked that part of it. That really struck a chord with me.
And I think that the anime does a good job of taking a lot of the outrageous visual humor of the manga and really bringing it to life in all sorts of wonderful ways. Yeah, another thing that I enjoy about Terryman is that he introduces himself as being from Texas, USA, which really sort of speaks to the way that American wrestling promotions will typically just be like, and this guy is from Norway. Or, he's like, have a very vague idea of geography and just be like, he's from one of those specific parts of that place over there that you can remember, The Australian is from the Outback, the American is from Texas. That keeps things simple.
Yeah, well, and if it's Terryman and he's going to be a American cowboy hero, that's an appropriate choice. Narrowing it down to a city in the USA, I don't know that that's particularly the way to go. I think Texas, USA that's Terryman's natural hometown.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the Double Cross Ranch might be too deep a cut to expect from... Anyway, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a GIF out of that guy hanging out the airplane scene and stick that up on Twitter, and I'm going to use this opportunity to plug our socials. If you like the Super Musclecast, because I just realized that I'm not just sitting here talking to you, Punch, I'm actually trying to make some kind of venture out of this. You can follow me on Twitter at musclebusting. We're also on Twitch, TV/musclebusting. Our main home is musclebusting.com. And, you can find me at the Dairy Queen up in Thunder Bay if you ever want to talk wrestling.
I'll keep that in mind.
Do you have anything to plug, Punch?
Not at this time. I'm hoping to have some pretty exciting stuff before too much longer, but I'm not going to make predictions or speculate just yet. I've got a few things I'm working on, but time will tell.
The man is playing his cards close to his chest. Well, in the meantime, if you want to play something other than cards, you can swing on by musclebusting.com, where we ought to have the beginnings of an English-language resource for Kinnikuman muscle fight in the works, including, most significantly, a place where you can download Kinnikuman muscle fight and some instructions on how to set it up and get playing if you're not too hip to the clicking on EXE business. So yeah, there's that. Another thing I just want to mention about these episodes, and this is a bit of information that I have held out from the Punch King this whole time, but Punch, how would you feel if I told you that episode 1 of the anime is not the same episode as episode 1 of the manga? That, in fact, the comic starts on a completely different episode, and the messenger from Planet Kinniku does not occur until manga episode 3, whereas Terryman does not make his debut all the way until manga episode 7, and Kinkotsuman doesn't appear until manga episode 18. I should say chapter instead of episode. I sound like an idiot. I sound illiterate. But what do you think, Punch? How does that change your interpretation of this episode, since you mentioned that it's a real setting up characters kind of episode?
Well, they do very strong work. It doesn't surprise me. I know that there are many cases like this, right, where an anime has a considerable backlog of manga that is kind of laying the groundwork for it, but when it comes time to do the anime, they maybe have a clear idea of the vision and some of the high points they want to hit, so we can kind of condense down some of the getting people up to speed and setting the train on the appropriate rails. Sounds like that's what's going on here, and it seems to make sense to me.
There's a bit of that, and I absolutely think that I like how the anime does a good job of setting up the Terryman, Kinnikuman brief rivalry turned grudging respect right from go, because I really do think that kind of enemies to friends arc is so pivotal to Kinnikuman that it deserves to be featured in the first episode, and quite frankly, I think Kinkotsuman is so, if not pivotal to Kinnikuman, then such a good gosh darn rival for Kinnikuman that I really appreciate having him debuted earlier in the series, and I like that he makes more frequent appearances as time goes on. I think that those are some good things that the anime does in comparison to the manga, and those are some of the reasons why I thought that it would be good to go with the anime instead of the manga for this project. That also, plus, it's fun to watch the pictures move.
It's fun to watch cartoons.
I love watching cartoons. All right. We both love cartoons, and we had a pretty good time with this episode. I don't know that there is too much else to say, so I will awkwardly dump it in your lap.
Well, we on the end of the episode, how about that ending jingle? We commented on this when we watched it once earlier, that the characters and some characters maybe who we haven't met yet, or some helpful walk-ons, are doing these dances in a very filtered and almost like we said, you're looking at it through a stained glass or a mosaic kind of way, while a humorous little theme song jingle plays at the end. I don't know if you'd consider throwing that on here to play us out. I know we're also going to be listening to The Hare and the Tortoise, was it?
Yes, indeed. Well, I think that I will play the Kinnikuman jingle as an outro and then throw on some Hare and Tortoise after that. So, good night, Punch.
Rock on.
めちゃ忙しいスーパーヒー